Welcome to the Sub 1000 Recruitment Podcast. With so much of the recruitment industry conversation aimed at big enterprise talent acquisition teams, we decided recruiters at smaller everyday organizations need to be heard. In 2023, we launched our free-to-join Sub 1000 online community. We have thousands of in-house recruiters and HR professionals from everyday organizations who recruit less than 1,000 staff a year, in some cases less than 100. And if you are listening to this, you've probably guessed the next bit. We've also launched a podcast to hear direct from those recruiters. Their stories, insights, and experiences about how they get the job done on a limited budget, with limited support, in either a small team or perhaps completely on their own. Tune in every fortnight to hear from your direct peers. And if you want to get involved, join our free online community at sub1000.com.
Right, so welcome to another edition of the Sub 1000 Recruitment Podcast. I'm here with a good friend and colleague, Lara Kenny, and I'm gonna get you, Lara, to introduce yourself. You've got a slightly different background to the people we normally speak to. You're a little bit of a geek, but I'll get you to maybe introduce yourself and maybe tell our audience a little bit about your past work history and what you're up to now.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And yeah, I'm kind of really excited to actually chat with you. So my background is to be fair, I've worked in pretty much every sort of sphere of industry. So I started my career in consulting, working on strategic projects and OD and stuff like that. I found that I really love the numbers side of things, so I sort of followed that trail, and I've ended up working on HR systems, on LMSs, and everything in between, and really found that actually the bit that I was really good at, the bit that I loved the most, was the numbers. So I've focused my career now on helping HR teams to nail the numbers, essentially, like figure out what the right things are to track, how to track them and get accurate data, and at the other end of it, how to analyze it and what to do next with it. So I've worked in universities, I've worked in big sort of multinational FTSE, New York Stock Exchange listed companies, and worked with some really cool teams from around the world, and it's all about the numbers for me.
And just give us that pitch on what it is you're doing now, because you're a bit more freelancing now, aren't you?
Yeah, so at the moment I deliver a Foundations of HR Data program, which is a 6-month program. It's a real kind of I call it a mentorship, which sounds a bit rubbish and everyone's got a mentorship at the moment, but it's all about literally working as closely as possible with sort of 10 to 12 people, walking them through the pillars of HR data, all the right things how to capture, and helping them to figure that all out. And there's all sorts of bits in there, from reporting, from sort of building dashboards, as well as some statistics as well, because I know that in HR we love people, not numbers. So we've never done that nasty bit, and I'm kind of here to fill in that little gap.
Cool. So first question up then. So thinking around perhaps more of a recruitment slant, but what do you think the numbers are, the metrics are that recruiters should be focused on?
Yeah, so when we kind of think about what our job is in recruitment, it's about getting enough of the right people in the right positions at the right time, essentially. And that is, a lot harder said or a lot harder done, than it is kind of looking at it on paper. And so when you then think about the numbers that you need to do that, they will be slightly different for every organisation. And I do always kind of, whilst there's kind of lists online of here's the 20 best recruitment metrics, some of them will be really helpful, and some of them won't be. But I like to try and encourage teams to look at what they need as a business, what matters for them. Is it what challenges have they got, and what do they need to do as a recruitment team? So it might be looking at things like how many people you're getting in the pipeline. It could be looking at diversity through the pipeline if you recognise that's a bit of a challenge. Or it could be as simple as things like time to hire. And again, when you kind of start to look at that, it's not just about saying, oh, we record time to hire, but actually thinking about which touch points matter for the business. So instead of saying, it's time to offer or time to first day or time to whatever, actually, if your industry has really long notice periods, when you hire people, that may not be helpful to include that in that metric because it's not something you can control as a team. You can only control what you're doing in terms of recruitment. And so that's where you sort of flex the metrics a little bit to what your team are actually doing. And yeah, I'll sort of talk a little bit later about the different types of metrics. So what sort of level you're looking at, but definitely thinking about what you have as challenges in your industry, in your business, and sort of tracking those with your metrics and your dashboards is kind of the way that I recommend teams sort of start looking at that kind of what metrics do we use. And you can definitely Google for those lists of here's the top 20, but then apply that filter of, okay, which ones work for us? And don't be afraid to flex them as well. So as I've kind of said, like time to hire, it's always on the list. It's a good one. It's important. It matters for workforce planning, but figure out what your touch points are that you're using in it. Don't feel that you have to go with, whatever's written online of start date or offer date. Figure out what works best for your business.
So is there different types of metrics for what you should be measuring versus what you should be focusing on?
That's a very good question. I'll sort of step back and look at metrics as a whole and the types of analysis or numbers you can look at. The main ones that most teams will be doing is either descriptive or diagnostic. They're really confusing words and both Ds, which doesn't make it any easier to sort of help people kind of figure out. But descriptive data is really kind of, it explains what's happened. It's like historical, it's past, it's literally kind of a sort of snapshot, a little flashpoint of what's happened. So figures like how many hires we've made, how many days to hire, that one can flip between the two, but I generally say it's more of a sort of descriptive one. It could also be about gender split in the hires that you've made. It could be about how many offers are rejected, but all of those ones that are more kind of numbers of literally what's happened, that's a descriptive sort of metric. And then the sort of next step on from that's a slightly more complicated to do, but also slightly more insightful and helpful, is the diagnostic metrics. And diagnostic is actually looking under the surface and doing a bit more explaining of that. Why did something happen? So again, it can get a bit confusing because the lines do merge and they're sort of a bit blurred. But when you're looking at, for example, how many female applicants you have, that change is really important. So the descriptive is we had 61% female applicants last year. But when you start to look into the diagnostic data, you can start to compare how that changed through the pipeline. And if anyone's listened to one of my webinars before, they're probably really bored of that metric, but I really love it because it does really display what's happening and where the issues start to happen that you can dig into. But if you kind of look at your funnel from applicants to interviews to offers, etc., that's when you start to get into the diagnostic of actually where is it different, where's it changed, and you can also look at other things and combine it with other things. So for example, you look at who's exiting the business and how you're replacing them, you get a really good rounded picture. So those are the two kind of metrics that I kind of talk about or think about in my head. And the descriptive stuff is useful, but it's even more powerful when it's coupled with the diagnostic stuff that actually tells the story or explains what's actually going on. Because if you say, we made 41 new hires last year, that sort of doesn't mean anything on its own. You don't know if that's good, you don't know if it's bad, you don't know if they're good hires, you don't know if they're bad hires, all of that kind of stuff. So kind of doing that next level, the diagnostic stuff is definitely the kind of the thing to start including in the way that you work, just to actually add more context and add meaning and stories and explanation to what's happening with your numbers.
So this is great for analysis. How does it work then for the day-to-day, the sort of monitoring sort of stats? What should people be thinking about, the underlying performance metrics that lead to the results? How do you look to sort of split those up for the things that people want to reflect on, maybe quarterly or biannually or annually, versus the things that actually drive performance day to day, week to week?
Yep. So I am a big fan, and maybe not everyone is, but actually how many open roles you've got, or at least how many open roles you've got sort of per recruiter. So adding that context of how many, like how big is the problem basically. If you've got 41 open vacancies, but you've got 41 recruiters, theoretically, that's not too much of a concern. If you've got 41 open roles, but you've only got 2 recruiters, that's actually a lot more challenging in most places to kind of fill. So looking at the activity stuff, so how many open roles you've got, how many recruiters you've got. A weird one is also if you've got any open roles in your recruitment team, because actually that's a bit of a red flag for you guys. You're trying to recruit with not a full bench or not a full team, so keeping an eye on that as well is worth just having on the end. I'd also kind of recommend looking at the source of your hires. And that does sort of lead into the longer term stuff a little bit as well. But that is one, it sounds a bit weird, but it's also one way to figure out if something's down in your kind of ecosystem. So if, for example, you're not getting any applications through like Reed, for example, but you know that that's a pretty normal one for your team, and suddenly there's 0 in there, what's happened? You can quite quickly realize that maybe an invoice has got lost, something's not been paid, and you've been cut off. And actually, if that's a really big source of kind of candidates for you, that's a problem. So just looking at the kind of, I guess, think about yourselves as a recruitment team, and what does normal look like for you? You need candidates coming in. You need kind of various job boards. You need to know how many jobs you've got open, because if you can't keep track of what jobs you've got no chance of actually filling them. And again, it sounds like a really weird one, but if there is an easy way, that's not always, but if there is an easy way to just keep an eye on your hiring managers and how responsive they are to you, that can be quite useful as well. Because again, most businesses have quite busy periods. For some, it's busy across the entire organization. For others, it's maybe busy in a couple of teams like sales or finance. But if you know that in like March, for example, hiring managers never respond to you, then that's also helpful information for you to look at what's going on and go, we know it's March, we've got all of these open roles, but the business isn't communicating with us. And that gives you a little kind of, just helpful information to help you figure out what's going on in your team, and what blockers there might be, and what challenges, and how you can sort of fix that as well.
And does all this data then help? You're collating this data, you're able to reflect on it, you can build your understanding of what's happened. Does this then lead to maybe the HR recruitment team having a greater internal power when it comes to resources, expenditure, budget, whatever that could be?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you can explain, firstly, what your team's doing, secondly, demonstrate that it's doing a good job, and thirdly, kind of use that information to say, we'd like this investment or this investment, you're definitely going to do a much better job, and you're going to have more success in the business. When you think about like finance teams or sales teams, the sales teams are always able to show their numbers. They've always got an excuse, right? Like if the sales don't go to plan, they've got some kind of data somewhere that explains why it didn't happen. Maybe the market was off. Maybe, they didn't have enough people in the top of the funnel, and that's marketing's fault. Whatever it was, the sales team and, every other team in the world, operations team can tell you that, a random example, but maybe there was a machine down, and they know that machine creates this percentage of the work that they do. And if that's down, they can't do it. So kind of, it helps teams to explain in a relatively non-arguable way what they're doing and why it was either good or bad. And in HR and in recruitment, we've not been so good at that because we've been numbers people. We always try and bring the human perspective. And I think to our detriment, because actually we don't speak the same language as the rest of the business. And that's probably why we've butted heads with most departments. So when we've got the numbers in our back pocket, we're speaking their language. And we've got a good kind of unarguable sort of set of information to say, look, we did our absolute best. We did these 10 things, but this one other thing wasn't in our favor, and we weren't able to do what we wanted. So absolutely, when you can, it's it's like arguing with a teenager, right? Like versus arguing with a toddler. It doesn't matter if you've got logic, facts, whatever with a toddler, whatever's in their head is what's going to work. But when you try and argue with a teenager, sometimes you can win on facts. You can kind of show to them, yeah, but when this happens, you can't do this. And then they might kind of realize and go, okay, yeah, fine. And then they'll be quiet and they'll ignore you for a bit. But it's kind of similar in business, right? Like if you can go to someone and have a conversation and they're annoyed and they don't agree with you and whatever it might be, and if you can go to them and show the steps, the numbers, the story, and say, yeah, but here's the explanation, it's really hard for them to argue with it and be irrational and just be grumpy for no reason. So the numbers absolutely are like the way to back up your team. Like we know that the teams have got the expertise, but it's the numbers, the stories, the kind of explanation of all of that that actually sort of gives them the reinforcement that they're doing the right things, but whatever reason that we know, it didn't quite go to plan.
Then how do you ensure that you get the buy-in from all parties to actually collect that data? Because that can be, I think the number one thing obviously with recruitment will be the ATS, and just ensuring that, you know, all of that recruitment function, offers, interviews, you know, everything else is logged in the ATS. I guess there's systematic things you can build in, you know, like the sources and that from the job boards that automatically happen. But how do you ensure that the human behavior all happens the way it's meant to happen for the data to be collected?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And if there's any kind of OD or change specialists, they will have a perfect answer. But there's an element of making sure that the processes have to include whatever it is. So trying to move processes into your system as much as possible rather than being offline. So back sort of 10 years ago, the email functionality and the interview scheduling and stuff wasn't great within the ATS systems, but actually now they're so much better. And to be fair, in quite a lot of ATS systems, you could probably do most of the work you need to from within it, like a CRM. So that's one step to, you know, like having it digitized, having that process digitized, being able to send emails, schedule interviews from the system is a great way that it's not really extra work. It's just a slight adjustment to the way that it happens. The other thing is being honest with the teams, because, you know, quite fairly, people get worried that it's to check up on what they're doing so that they can be penalised, they can be punished and say, well, you didn't book in 16 interviews last week and that's your target. And I think we all know, like in HR, the only way to get people on side is to be honest with them and tell them what our intentions are, tell them what it's for, why, and you have to be honest about that. If you try and pretend that it's just to help the business or it's just to do whatever, but in reality, you then turn around and start telling people they haven't booked 16 interviews, they're never going to believe you again and you needn't have bothered. But if you can be honest with them and say, look, we know that we want to improve the way that we work with the business and we want to, you know, be able to show the good work that we're doing, show the impacts of what we're doing. I think most teams generally will get on board. And is there any other tips? I think also just helping the team, like including them on the data as well. So I've seen quite a lot of teams, and this is probably a slightly more old-fashioned way of doing it, but actually it used to be that only the senior leaders in the HR or recruitment teams had the data. They present it to their senior leadership team, whether that was MD or whoever, and that seemed to be quite limited to that senior kind of group. And then that feels quite sort of like the rest of the team are left out, and actually they don't feel like they know what's being reported on, and it feels like they're being reported on and that they're kind of, you know, the scapegoats or whatever for what's happening. But actually what I've seen a lot of businesses do, and like this is absolutely the best way to do it, is firstly ask your teams for their support in that sort of data gathering and presentation process. You know, like, here's the data that we're going to present to the team next week. Do you have any comments you want to add? Is there any experiences you've had, any stories you've got, you know, any interviews you've had that you've got something that can kind of back up what we're saying here, any anecdotes, stuff like that. And then it goes to senior leadership and then that gets fed back. I think is absolutely like the only way that you can do it and do it really well. So yeah, that kind of communication loop and including the team, like it's kind of their data in a way, it's what they do. So, you know, let them be part of the process and sort of help them feel like they're influencing what's happening as well, rather than it's happening to them and they're just pawns in whatever's sort of happening.
I guess part of it comes down to the sort of the culture of the organization in regards to data, and I suppose people buying into the fact that we're a data-led organization, is a high trust culture, and you know, people can, you know, the data is acted upon. You know, we're not just, this isn't a process we do just to tick a box, but stuff happens. I guess, you know, how do you sort of, you know, move companies to that sort of culture if they don't have it in at the start?
Start simple. And again, everyone will be bored of me saying this because it sounds so ridiculous, but just strip it back to what's the absolute minimum that you need to do. And you should find that actually there aren't any complicated metrics in there that maybe the team don't understand. And it's also, that's quite a direct link to what the team does. So when you strip it back and you just kind of say, look, we just want to capture these few things, we want to start reporting to the business. It's kind of like that baby steps thing of, you know, you just put your toes in the water, you're like, nothing bit me, so it's all good. And you start to build on it, and then it starts to kind of, you know, snowball into actually a much more successful way of doing things. So definitely kind of, yeah, just try and do as little, like be as simple as possible, do as little as possible in terms of reporting, nail that, get it right, kind of feed that back to the team. And let them see that there were no negative consequences, that, you know, it's not this kind of ridiculous thing that we want them to do, just a little change. That's definitely kind of the best way to do it, just to start that ball rolling. I think when you kind of go too hard or too fast and you kind of go, we've been this, you know, maybe slightly more offline, not very data-led team, and suddenly we're going to implement this ATS and we're going to do reporting and we're going to send it to the senior team and we're going to literally chase you for every little thing that you haven't done in the system. You haven't marked this, you haven't ticked this box, you haven't done this. Honestly, that's the surefire way to drive half of your team out, because they're just like, I don't know what is happening here, but I want no part of it. It's absolute chaos. But if you can bring it back, explain, and start with a few little changes, a few little things that you report on that the team can, you know, influence, I think that, yeah, definitely the best way to start. Yeah, keep it simple.
And where do you then sit on gathering data from candidates to measure their experiences, maybe post-interview or even at the end of the recruitment process?
It's really hard, actually, and I was working on an offboarding survey yesterday, and I was having some little thoughts in my head of like, when's the right time to do it? You know, is there a good time? Is it going to get the right kind of information? And it's similar for the interview process. Like, there's quite a few different factors. Like, if they've interviewed but they haven't got the job, there's still a chance, and they probably guard their responses a little bit better. Like, they're probably not going to be brutally honest with you and tell you that they had an absolutely awful interview, because they kind of still want a job. But at the other kind of end of it, there is that sort of, even not great data is better than no data in some circumstances. Not every circumstance, but I think it will probably depend on your organization. And I'm also not a fan of over analyzing everything. You know, sometimes it's better and easier and makes more sense to not interrogate every part of the process. However, I guess maybe sort of bringing it back to what I said at the beginning of, you know, what are your issues and where do things start to like get misaligned? Maybe that's a good place to start. If you realize that after the interview process, your diversity gets kind of a bit askew, and you've got sort of more women or men than the sort of average that's been running through, maybe that's an opportunity to look at your kind of interview process and is it the right thing? The other, and when I was working on the onboarding survey, the kind of similar like process in your head is that's only the successful candidates. So something must have gone right to make them join, but there's probably a bunch of people that went through the interview process, really didn't enjoy it and it wasn't right, and they chose not to accept an offer. And how do you get the feedback from them? That's probably not a perfect world answer, but you can of course obviously use the onboarding survey to get interview feedback as well. And I think it's also important to remember like what the actual feedback is that you want. So do you want to know whether they enjoyed the interview? Might be helpful. Do you want to know that they were able to share the information they needed to? Like, was it a good interview in the sense of they gave their best self, or they got the most information from the organization? Maybe that's kind of what you're looking at. And that would be slightly different for most people. Maybe some of the cooler techie businesses might be more interested in people enjoying the process, rather than kind of looking at the technical side of things. Maybe some of the more old school businesses really want to know whether people got to, give their best self during the interview process. But I definitely think there's a place for it, and it can be helpful, and it's something to consider, especially I think if you have any challenges. I'll call it sort of diversity and equality generally, but if you've got people with diverse needs in terms of sort of accessibility, you again, maybe they didn't even get to the interview stage actually, because for whatever reason it wasn't accessible to them. So you do miss out a little bit there. But if you've got any gender challenges, if you've got any other kind of like ethnicity challenges, or where you've got people with different accessibility needs, whether that's neurodiversity or physical, that can be a really good way to think about, are people having a different experience and is it right? And again, like taking it back to what's important for your team. What do you want your team of interviewers to do? And whether it's recruitment recruitment team members who are your interviewers, or whether it's hiring managers, it will all be completely different as well. And it's harder for you to sort of reach out to the hiring managers and say, look, don't be afraid of this process. The interviewees are going to rate you afterwards, but it's all good, don't worry about it. That's a lot harder to get buy-in for than your recruitment team getting some feedback from them. But yeah, as I said, it kind of goes back to what do you want them to do as well? Are you rewarding them more as part of their performance review about the candidate experience? If it is, then it's super important to find a way to do that, whether that's a post-interview survey or something slightly different. If actually that isn't something that you sort of performance review people on, or it's just not a challenge that you're experiencing, then I'd probably go, don't overcomplicate it, and look at something else. But again, problems can always crop up as well, so it's hard to sort of say don't worry about looking at that, because you don't know when something's going to start kind of causing an issue in a certain process if you're not looking at it. But super kind of useful tool, I guess, when done in the right way, like most things in life, fortunately.
Because I guess there's these pockets of interviews that are happening where HR recruitment have got no visibility. They literally don't know anything about what happens, what the experience was, or they may get that one data point, like an email complaining from a candidate, and is that the reality? So if you're working off one data point, that sounds a bit daft. I was going to follow up then. I'm also a fan, and something that we're trying to build in to the ATS, of actually surveying recruitment teams. So so it works two ways. If you're going to be surveying the hiring manager's performance in regards to interviews, it seems also fair that the recruiters are saying, look, we get surveyed as well. You get to give your opinion on what was your experience of working with our department. Did we support you correctly? Is basically what it comes down to.
I'm a massive fan of kind of, I guess it's customer surveys essentially, but your internal customer of hiring managers and their teams. But absolutely, like, quality of hire is a really hard thing to measure. If it wasn't, we probably wouldn't be talking about it, and there wouldn't be hundreds of blog posts telling you need to measure it, but actually not telling you how to. And that's a really good way to look at quality of hire. It's not perfect, but if you ask the right questions and you're able to sort of tap into your hiring managers and say, how well did that person match? And if, again, every recruitment process is different. Sometimes you get one absolutely gold standard candidate and the rest of them are, not necessarily poorly fitting, but it's good to have some variety in there and different sort of combinations of skills. But definitely kind of like reflecting that back and saying, you tell us what we could do better. A win-win, right? The business gets to say, okay, I didn't have a great experience with the HR team, but I fed it back, and actually they know now. I've heard that they're going to make some changes. You make changes, and then the business knows that you're sort of changing to fit them, and that's absolutely brilliant. And you also get some feedback on quality of hire. I'm going win-win. I might be being naive, and there's probably something really obvious that I haven't thought about that's a negative of it, but yeah, I think it's a super critical tool and probably very underused as well.
So it's interesting that you're thinking about quality of hire, but we can talk about that a bit further. But I've never hugely thought about quality of hire as been part of that process with, you know, how do you judge the recruiters? I suppose it's how you judge the overall recruitment performance, like how is the department, are they delivering? But there's the market, there's talent shortage, there's lots of things going on, obviously. So I guess I don't disagree. I just think it's interesting. I guess part of it as well is also comparing the experience, though. You know, the bits that they can control, like how fast did they respond? What, you know, is that internal piece as well?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, literally, cannot fault it, because you have to keep a check. Like, if the business isn't happy with what you're doing as a team, then every good thing you do is going to be overrun by somebody in the corner kind of going, but the recruitment team, but if you can help the team and you can orient and adjust the way that you work to what the business needs, yeah, I mean, absolutely, it's the best way to work. Obviously there's some best practice stuff and some balance, and not everything will be perfect, but yeah, absolutely, like, figure out how the business wants you to work with them and work with them. And when you think about EAs and PAs and things like that, they're quite often taught to like make it super easy for the people that they're interacting with to give them what they need, because half their life is spent chasing down calendar bookings or dates or documents or whatever. And I kind of take that same approach to HR and to everything else. You know, if you can figure out how the other person wants to work you and make it as easy as possible, be as quick as possible, give them the documents you need. Like, I'm sure there's some businesses where the recruiters aren't sharing a little recruitment pack, and, you know, it's a bit of a pain in the backside. It takes a little bit of time sometimes to pull together. But if you're setting your team up with interviews, but you're not providing a CV and maybe some suggested interview questions, or, you know, some information about them that you've gathered through the recruitment process, missing a massive opportunity there to make the hiring manager's life easier and also make the whole process cleaner, because your teams are then not repeating the same questions and annoying and frustrating your candidates because they're getting asked the same question 3 times. So absolutely, like, figure out how the business wants you to work, make it as easy as possible for them, and then you get some massive supporters in the business as well when you want some help later on down the line.
Yeah, I guess the more data you're collecting, you're avoiding that, which happens to us in our business sometimes. I'm going to call it a single data point, but it's not even that. It's just a one-off. You end up dealing with an anecdote. Someone's saying, well, but Tony said when he dealt with this that, you know, and that's fine, but, you know, what does the data tell you? So you can move away from anecdotes, move to the actual thing. I guess quality of hire could be anecdotal as well. So many organizations, very, very few organizations that I meet at our level, you know, normally our customers and people on our workshops and webinars are most typically a few hundred staff, maybe a few thousand, and very, very, very few measure quality of hire. Did you want to talk firstly about the various ways you can measure quality of hire in your experience? And, you know, I'm a big believer, probably like you, just anything you're measuring is probably going to be better than, you're not going to get perfection. It's progress over perfection.
Yeah, absolutely. So quality of hire, I will start, and I've probably alluded to it already, but it is incredibly difficult to measure. It's incredibly imperfect to measure, and is one of those, and you kind of touched on it earlier, like, it's subject to so many external influences, like the market, like the rate of pay that you've got, which, you know, in most cases is relatively inflexible. You don't have much choice, and so many other things, you know, timing in the year. It could even be as simple as, you know, you don't offer flexible working and you miss out on a whole pool of people. So yeah, it's a tricky one because it's so open to different influences. But there's definitely, and again, it's from a statistical point of view, here's the nerdy bit coming out. It's also really hard to measure because you don't have the benefit of seeing how somebody who was successful during the interview process sort of performed versus somebody who wasn't successful in the interview process. The only way that you could do that, which would never happen because it's absolutely ridiculous, is if you hired the worst candidate from the pack and the best candidate from the pack, you put them both in the business and you compared their performance. Even that's not perfect because that's only two pieces. That's only two sort of a population of two. So there is no good way to measure it. It's, you know, I guess in some ways fundamentally flawed. However, is a critical kind of objective of the recruitment team to bring in quality hires? Yes. So do we have to figure out a way to measure that and sort of reflect on how well we're doing? Yes, unfortunately, there's, you know, imperfect as it is, we do have to kind of figure that out. So some of the things that I've seen people and kind of in the broader kind of universe have seen used is things like whether people pass probation. And again, like it's subject to a few different influences, but whether someone passes probation is a very simple, not perfect, but one way to look at it. If you are a business that has at least some form of sort of skills matrix or skills kind of mapping about what you expect in role, and you're able to compare new candidates to that and say what skills do they have, and therefore how do they perform later in the job. You've got that. You've got performance reviews. So you know, the first performance review after somebody's hire, how did they do? You can take a little bit of a 180. And to be fair, kind of like what you've been talking about with that sort of recruiter feedback versus sort of hiring manager towards recruitment feedback, you can look at it both ways. So you can ask your recruiter to sort of assess someone and provide some data points on their skills or match to the role's needs. But you can also ask the hiring manager to do that. And you could ask that at sort of day one, but then also at sort of day 30, day 60, and see how well actually because there's kind of two elements, right? There's how well the recruitment process elicited that day, how accurate was the recruitment process in sort of predicting that someone's skills on the job. But there is also, you know, their skills on the job. Do they have the right skills? Are they good at their job? So yeah, you can kind of do it a little bit more, you know, you can ask good questions, but it's still a little bit more qualitative or sort of human based in the sense of what did the recruiter think? What did the hiring manager think? Is there any other ways that you could do it? If you do have any, and it's similar to the sort of skills mapping, but if you do have any skills assessments that you use as part of the recruitment process or your sort of employment process, those can be really helpful as well. But yeah, it is a tricky one and relies on a lot of different factors. It relies on, I'd argue, a little bit of guesswork as well. But if you, and again, it's going to be different for every business, but if you can look at what is important to you, whether that's performance reviews, whether it's, you know, if it's a salesperson, for example, you've probably got a much easier job of figuring out whether they're a good quality hire or not. And if you can sort of think about the other influences like manager, because the manager is going to make a big difference to how well that person does in the first 30 days. And yeah, if you can sort of think about those different influences for your business and think about what's important to you, whether it's passing probation, because again, like, so data's super complicated. So apologize. It feels like I'm going like a bit of a whirlwind, but you know, sometimes actually passing probation can impact on like your recruiter fees. And if you use lots of external recruiters and you pay for that and people don't pass probation, that's actually quite a good measure of quality of hire, because not only does that impact your finances because you've probably got a payback and you get a bit of a refund on that, but it's good feedback for the recruiters because something's not working. Whereas if you're not using them, maybe something different is kind of important. And again, having a bit of a rough idea of what normal is for your business, what a normal kind of probationary pass level is, 95%, 99%, whatever it is. It will kind of be different for each business. But yeah, looking at what makes sense for your business, which is so unhelpful, because if you're not super experienced with numbers, nothing makes sense, and it's all just kind of big metrics. But yeah, kind of I thoroughly recommend to teams to literally just sit down and have a big thought session, whether it's outside, whether it's in the boardroom, and sort of lay everything out on paper, kind of bit of process mapping, but just kind of think about your teams and think about like what you need to achieve at the end of the day and what you can pull along the way to kind of figure that out. And then just go, is there something better? No, well, we can use this for now. And yeah, it could be probationary periods, it could be something else. But yeah, long, very confusing answer.
No, that's good. So just I like the process now, because it sort of starts you thinking, what is the big challenge? What's the big overriding thing we're trying to do? Okay, and what are the steps that we take? What are the important steps that help us to get there? And how do we measure these? And how do we measure what good looks like? Because I guess you need to understand what your metrics are, and from there you can understand any changes you make. So if we're talking about quality of hire, if you change an assessment, or you bring in a new assessment tool, the one metric is going to be, let's see what this does to quality of hire. Because I guess recruiters are always going to find a solution, aren't they? They're always going to fill a role, because they're just going to work and work and work until they fill it. But so you could argue all recruiters are the same, apart from some are able to fill roles faster than others. Yeah, but if you're measuring quality of hire, now all of a sudden all recruiters are not the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I was also going to ask you, my favorite subject at the moment is obviously AI, and lots more potential now with AI to monitor performance. So I'll give you an example, something that we're looking at here. We're in a Zoom call at the moment, but we're actually going to be looking at Teams. Most of our customers are using Teams before Zoom, really. This conversation can be extracted, the transcript and the audio, and it will tell us if this was an interview, and I'm the interviewer, how long did I speak for? How many questions did I ask? Did I go on any monologues, really long questions? And we can have all that data. And we can also then put a filter on that data, maybe to look at diversity and say, does my interview technique change if I'm interviewing a young female versus an old male, or any other aspect of diversity? So an awesome amount of data is available for you eventually, coming soon. And I'm just really interested in how, I guess, how you work out which data to pick, and then also how do you bring in this culture in a nice way of monitoring performance and using that to help people, hopefully, rather than hit them with a stick.
Yeah, it is super tricky. I mean, when we were talking earlier about just making changes or sort of using more data, like humans are naturally disinclined to like change. So, you know, initially your thoughts are, change, no. And then you've got the added layer of, you're watching me, no. But I think, again, if you can talk to your teams and help them to understand why, show them some really cool stuff. Like, I think we're all kind of excited, like little teenagers at heart that want to see shiny things and cool things, and, you know, like, yeah, it's cool, right? So I think if you can help teams to sort of see that, and I think you also have to be really honest about, because I think a lot of people, there's a little bit of education in there, because lots of people don't understand what AI means. So they might think that, and in some cases they will, but that's when we get onto the ethics of AI and what you do with it. But they may think that what's going to happen is like the old school, you're going to record the call and somebody's going to sit there and listen to it back and decide that that was a good or a bad call. And that's quite invasive, and, you know, nobody likes that. But if you can show them behind the scenes, and a good company like whether that's Hireful or any other kind of company that might be providing AI to do that, if you can get their sales reps or members of their team to show how that works, show what's actually recorded, explain how, you know, there's a difference between we record the call and it's just a voice recognition thing versus we literally take a transcript and your manager can read the transcript. That's, I think, really helpful. And yeah, I think also giving people access to that information as well. So I guess like in some kind of spheres of like performance management, for example, where you encourage the person to reflect on their own performance first, and then you come together and ask their manager to provide feedback, actually giving that person access to the exact same information as their line manager, to say, here's the sort of scores from the interviews you've done recently, and like the example you've just used of, here was your interview with a middle-aged white man, but here was your interview with a younger Asian female. And they can see that information. There's nothing hidden. There's no extra information that line managers have. They can see it. They can reflect on it. And maybe you give them an opportunity first to sort of reflect on that and make the relevant changes. And then 3 months down the line, you say, okay, let's come in and look at your more recent stuff. I guess it's ownership, it's accountability, it's treating people like adults to be able to say, look, there's the same information I have. I'm not hiding anything. Have a look at it. Is that what you wanted? Is that who you want to be as an interviewer? If it's not, and there's some clear differences, and that's a big concern, that's a different, kind of performance issue. But actually, I think most people aren't trying to be problematic or trying to be unfair. They just don't realise. So give them the information, let them self-correct before you then come in and sort of, I guess, intervene or give feedback is a really good way to help them get familiar with the tools and feel like it's a tool for them as well, not just a tool to tell them off later when something doesn't go to plan.
I guess leading on to that is about benchmarking, which we haven't spoke about a lot, but I guess within the organization, so benchmarking them so they can see where they sort of fit against the averages and that side of things, how well they're doing against their peers.
Yeah, benchmarking is tricky. It's sort of, go back to statistics, it's kind of imperfect in some ways. But I think benchmarking against themselves, benchmarking against, like, don't be afraid to, when you're thinking about your teams, to actually say, not here's the gold standard, but obviously we'd like all of our interviews to be 30-70, with the interviewer speaking only 30% and the rest is 70%. So it doesn't even have to be about you're doing better than other people. Competition sometimes helps, depends what the kind of topic is. But yeah, we also shouldn't be afraid of giving absolute targets and saying, we want to aim for this. We like best practice suggests that interviewers should only speak this much, and let's kind of aim for that target. So yeah, whether it's a target, whether it's a benchmark, giving people some context, to go back to something that I've kind of said as well, what does that mean? What does good look like? Is super, super helpful.
On that note, I'll share with people listening along, no one will be able to see even watching the video. I've actually got a coaching tool that tells me how fast I'm talking, how many monologues I've done. I've done 3 monologues in this podcast, which is just long questions. And my overall talk time as well, which is running at 21%. It tells me my filler words, which are and I use so quite a lot. I don't actually think the filler words can help me, because it just puts it in your head and you become you almost just hit a roadblock because every time you go to use that word. But it's interesting that there are tools out there now that will coach the user one-to-one, and so they can see. I think you've got to get the balance right, because you can fire so much data at someone that they can't operate. But there's some cool tech out there.
There is some cool tech, absolutely.
Cool, Lara, let's wrap this up here now. I wanted to just give you a last chance. Do you want to just briefly talk a bit more about your program? Because I know obviously that's your big passion. So just maybe give us a bit of an under the hood example of the sort of things you get up to.
Yeah, so as I said, it's sort of building on a couple of pillars. So reporting, statistics, HR data best practice as well. So we do talk through some principles. We'll talk a little bit about ethics, which can be quite boring. I have a really good analogy that I came up with when it was raining, when I was making a wedding cake last year. So before I went on leave, which I'm really excited to share with people, because I think actually it's going to really kind of help them understand the sort of difference between something quite statistical. So a lot of the stuff, or a couple of the modules, will be about statistics. It's something I'm really passionate about, and I think we need to really understand them properly. Of course, we might not necessarily need to calculate things like percentages or averages, but we do need to understand how they're created. And so the analogy, and something we'll talk about in the sort of statistics part, is the importance of spread. So we're all really familiar with averages, we're all really familiar with percentages and things like that, but what we're not familiar with is looking at basically the range and how the data is spread across a particular sort of grouping, and that can be really, really important. So in the context of recruitment, for example, if we're thinking about, I don't know, the average number of roles that are filled every month, that's really helpful. We need to know that, but the variance in that can also be quite helpful. It can unlock different information and different contexts. So, you know, maybe the lowest is 0, and there's some months where 0 jobs get filled, and actually that can be quite a big waste. You're paying for a whole team for a month. What have they been doing? What's blocking them? And kind of looking at that. What's the highest? Maybe there's some months where it's 60, and you can look into that and figure out. But actually, if it averages 41, and that's because it's about 35 to 45 every month, that's a different situation, and a different kind of, there might be different sort of interventions you want to do than a business where it ranges from 0 to 60. So that's something we talk about. Statistics module is something I kind of really enjoy talking about, and I think is really important for HR and recruitment people to understand, because I think it unlocks a lot more from their data rather than just looking at percentages, looking at their averages. When we start to understand spread, we can do some really cool stuff, and it helps us to figure out what's going on with the numbers a little bit more than just here's the average. So yeah, my analogy is about that. I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to save it for people on the course. But it's, yeah, there's going to be, basically, I'm an absolute nerd. I love talking about numbers. I've delivered the program with sort of some international teams before, and I know that everybody really kind of found it helpful, and hopefully my passion, enthusiasm, and absolute nerdiness will encourage everyone else to think that numbers are pretty cool too. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we do. They'll be really informal. As I said, 10 to 12 people in a Zoom workshop, really kind of hands-on. I've got some sort of practice data sets that we can run through, do the analysis together. And yeah, it's going to be time spent with me, talking you through, answering questions, all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, can you tell that I really am enthusiastic about it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you love data like I love AI and recruitment technology. Yeah, I'm also a big fan of data. I think you might outdate. I'm pretty sure you outdate me.
just a little bit.
Excellent, Lara. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you. You've been a wonderful guest, and hopefully people will listen to this and want to reach out to you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to see you as always.